Now we get into John 13. The belief of Peter, Rooster-Eater, which is, okay, little funny wordplay on the nursery rhyme. Peter, pumpkin eater. How many of you know that rhyme? Yeah, few. And that's not a terribly politically correct rhyme. But if you read the second verse to it, it has some good application to it. The second verse is urging you to read well and spell well in order to love well. Now, mostly this chapter is a continuation on the unbelief of Judas. An unbelief that John seems awfully eager to share with the world. So much for that old worn out saying of, if you can't say something good about somebody, don't say anything, right? Anyways, John goes on about the unbelief of Peter as well. An unbelief that John will return to for his closing chapter. Yet, was that actually an unbelief? Or was that just a deep water belief in the shallow end? If anybody knows that Casting Crown song, Deep Water Faith in the Shallow End. Well, we will examine that difficulty a little later on. But let's start off with the very first verse. And this is where we have our commentator Barrett disputing the dating of the Last Supper of Jesus, with Barrett insisting that his Johnny's fresh historical account actually contradicts the accounts of the Synoptic Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, suggesting that the Last Supper, which is noted in verse 1, appears to have occurred one day earlier than otherwise accounted for in those Gospels. One day earlier, since the Holy Moly Passover is unaccounted for in John, a festival that is not to be neglected by proper Jews. So this is an awfully bold contradiction, Barrett says, supposedly made by a much later Johnny, according to prominent skeptics Boltman, Brown, Barrett, and more recently, Richard Bauckham, which the B team, they might call them, killer bees. Presumably, a claim made by some Johnny-come-lately in order that Jesus might symbolically be the Passover supper on the very date of his crucifixion. Presumably, a later Christianizing effort made in order to transition out the sacrificial lamb of the Jewish Passover, a lamb that is not mentioned by John anytime after John the Baptist. Now, or presumably this novel attempt at revision by some Johnny-come-lately was in order to resolve some other perceived Jewish conflicts, such as a carrying of arms, swords, during a festival, or having a trial during a festival, or purchasing sticky and stinky burial stuff during this festival. Conflicts which are not insuperable, according to Barrett. However, blustering Barrett does not address what he calls the real contradiction. Presumably, the very real dating conflict is quite the permissible problem for him, according to Carson. And at the very least, he should have addressed the flimsy reason for Johnny's replacement motive. Yet, he didn't. Yet, in the end, his crow was far worse than his bite. And to that end, I have an even greater amazement and appreciation for Barrett, for his insuperable ability to believe the account of his Johnny-come-lately, despite Johnny's overwhelmingly ahistorical agenda. Now that's a true believer for you. Yet, as Carson so ably presents, there is no contradiction here. This huge dispute is much ado over nothing. Carson insists that this controversial just before the Passover festival phrase is strictly in reference to the unique foot washing by Jesus that occurred prior, a different sacrament altogether. Something that was definitely not a standard part of the Passover festival, a humbling sacrament that we might even practice in our very day, at the risk of turning it into an annual farce and a display of buffoonery, as Rome does, according to Calvin. Now, this sacramental distinction is grammatically indicated in our very next verse, where we have a grammatical ambiguity of whether the actual word being used here is called an ingressive aorist or not, blah, blah. Whether the original word was properly genomai, or rather genomeno, instead of genomeno, with the latter ingressive spelling being used in our earliest manuscript, and with that ingressive spelling not contradicting the actual content of this chapter, blah, blah. And you can read all the rest of that. Anyways, it's all grammatical stuff. So actually, this was indicating something radically different than the Passover. It was indicating a foot washing, a pedantic foot washing, you might say, before the real washing with blood occurs. Yet, to our commentator Barrett's defense, our translational abilities have improved remarkably since his time. They have improved immensely with our ever-increasing earlier and better manuscripts that he never had, and computer algorithms that he never had either. To give you a current example, the concept of a deponent verb has now been utterly deposed for a middle voice in this very decade of ours, largely due to the work of Stan Porter and Con Campbell. So let's be gracious and give old true believer Barrett a break on that one. He deserves that very much, at least. Then we have a similar situation with Judas in this very verse, with two different spellings of the name Judas, which indicate either a nominative or a genitive, which indicate either one, that the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas to betray Jesus, or that the devil already had it in his heart that Judas would betray Jesus, with the earliest and best manuscripts indicating the latter, according to Comfort. Not an important issue, however, gives you some idea of the challenges involved with translation. And that's helpful in our point to follow. Let's get down to Peter. Peter, Rooster-Eater. Let's get down to Peter's belief, with Jesus saying Peter will deny him. Ooh. Deny him before the rooster crows. You will disown me 3 times. Yeah, preceded by that amen and amen again. Okay, with all the Gospels picking on poor Peter Pumpkin Eater with this convicting prophecy. Now, it is instructive to note that Matthew and Mark were even more harsh with Peter in that respect. Even more harsh by including the hostile saying, "Get behind me, Satan," in an earlier conversation. A saying supposedly spoken to our Rooster-Eater Peter, presumably a metaphorical saying. Yet our presumptions might be entirely wrong in that respect, since Jesus also had extensive conversations with Satan earlier as well. Similar pre-disciple conversations with Matthew, Mark, and Luke relay in their synoptic accounts. A pre-disciple conversation where Jesus similarly said, "Away from me, Satan," in Matthew 4:10. And that's an earlier conversation which Jesus may have relayed to his disciples at that foot washing point in time, since there's a pretty tight relationship between what's happening here and what was happening there. About someone trying to thwart the grand plan, in order to save some skin. Now, naturally, our Dr. Luke has the more clear saying in that respect, with the more clear saying of Satan has asked to sift all of you like wheat. Yep. Unfortunately, King James kind of dropped the ball on that part. If this is a saying which also relates very closely what the devil had in his evil heart with respect to sifting Judas at this point. A sifting which Jesus granted at this point. A sifting which goes to show that Satan doesn't always get what he wants. Which goes to show that Satan will only be permitted to sift some of you. Thank God. So, to say that Peter was not a believer at this point is certainly not fair, even if it appears that he is a follower of Satan at that sifting point, and even if there is some suggestion that the Holy Spirit only came upon those disciples at a much later point. That's neither here or there. What this rooster prophecy merely suggests is that Peter would deny Jesus 3 times in order to save his own skin at some future point in time. It does not mean that Peter did not believe that Jesus could save him from his sin at this present point, nor that Peter did not have some sense of Jesus being that essential I am of verse 19 here. Simple Simon Peter simply could not process that saving that would be accomplished at this confusing point, and was simply rash in thinking that he had to defend the great I am. In fact, there's pretty good indication that they were all believers at this point, excepting Judas, of course. A pretty good indication with the earlier saying, many, even among the leaders, believed in him, as we read in John chapter 12:42. And a pretty good indication, as we will see in verse 7 of our next chapter as well. But for now, a really, really good indication with Jesus saying, you are clean, though not every one of you, in verse 10. And to that end, it seems that this heel of a Judas, heel of a Judas, our NIV unfortunately dropped that heel part, heel of a Judas was not among the clean ones. Judas was not among the ones that Jesus had chosen. We read about in verse 18. Instead, Judas was Satan's footstool, much like Gollum was the footstool to the One Ring. And the fate of Judas was grammatically sealed at the subsequent Last Supper, which always precedes this token Passover supper, which is a mini supper that occurs just after it. Which is to say, as soon as Judas took the bread, he was thoroughly possessed, according to Carson, and he became the unwitting foil to Satan. Yet let's take a look at one more heiress before we close this devotion. Let's take a look at what is called a timeless heiress. By Barrett. Let's look at the word edoken, which means to give in verse 3. To give on a constant basis. In that respect, the Father is giving all things to Jesus on a constant basis. And I like that. I like that a lot. I like that even if our earliest manuscripts read dedoken instead. An earlier reading which suggests that the Father gave all things to Jesus at a certain point in time. A reading which is not exactly right if Jesus was in fact God from the very beginning. However, God was not Jesus from the very beginning, now was he? And if you recall, the word became flesh in our first chapter of John. So those earliest manuscripts of ours made a completely valid distinction here, even if that distinction sounds a whole lot like the heresy of something called adoptionism. If it makes it sound as if Jesus adopted godhood at some later date. So what, you ask? Yeah, so buttons. Here is an application for you to draw from this constant giving. You should know that that very same word is used with respect to us washing one another's feet in verse 15. For us to be involved in their cleansing, washing them on a constant basis. And not just a one-shot deal here. Just like believing is not just a one-shot deal either. It is believing on a constant basis. To wash one another in remembrance of him. To love one another as he loved us, as we read in verses 34 and 35 here. So, was this loving one another actually a new law, as Jesus mentioned here? Was it? No. Not according to Leviticus chapter 19. It was quite an old law. And according to Calvin, Jesus was just being, well, novel here, funny here. And this was being novel, this novelty was for added emphasis, as we might confirm with John as well in his smaller letter. Then Calvin adds that we are to love those who love Jesus even more, far more than all others. And we'll get into that later on too. And so remember that in your chart. We're giving quizzers to focus far more on your believing brothers than all others, as selfish as that might seem. And to do that constant loving in constant remembrance of what he has done for us, washing us on a constant basis, since we unfortunately continue to sin on a constant basis. Though not nearly as much as before, hopefully. And those that deny that constant sinning are simply liars. You can read that in the smaller letter of John as well. The truth is not in them. And in closing, will you quizzers deny that constant foot washing, just as Peter did, as Peter nearly did? If so, your feet are standing on very shaky ground. If so, you are standing on sifting ground, just like Judas was, and you don't want to